time.
Yeah,
And
that's what you do.
so,
And the SEC watched our videos and they had zero issues with them. So
okay, good.
yeah, so okay, so just do that. So there are three big topics, and then we basically have two lightning round questions. And if you want, I mean, I can just throw a third one in there, which is the Winnie the Pooh stabber movie. I don't know. We could just talk about that at the end. Have you guys seen the trailers for that? It's coming
No.
out. They basically took Winnie the Pooh and then made it like a horror movie. All right, welcome to episode 72 of Farm to Markets. Today we are talking about the Ohio train derailment, stagflation, black market marijuana, and we have more lightning round questions at the end. Norfolk Southern is facing scrutiny from regulators, public officials, and residents as cleanup and environmental monitoring efforts continue in a small Ohio town after a cargo train of 150 cars derailed near the Ohio town of East Palestine, close to the Pennsylvania border on February 3rd. Of the 38 rail cars that derailed, 11 were hazardous material cars, and officials assumed the content of 9 cars had seeped into the ground and of nearby waterways or burned. It's unclear if Norfolk Southern violated any safety principles, but do you think they should be held criminally responsible? And why do you think media coverage of this event was so delayed?
Well, I'll start with criminally liable. As you kind of alluded to, the information coming out of this incident is kind of sketchy and all over the map. Like, I keep trying to figure out like who made the decision to burn the chemicals or what exactly happened to cause the derailment, and they either don't know or the reporting is kind of mixed. From the standpoint that I'm looking at, is it doesn't sound at the moment like Norfolk Southern violated any laws, rules, or regulations. Like, maybe they could have done more to prevent the derailment, but I don't see anything like, yep, they clearly violated, EPA regulation, blah, 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 and then it derailed and everything exploded. I don't see that, so I don't know how you would hold them criminally liable if they didn't break a law. Um, as far as like why it's all over the map, I think there's, from almost the beginning, what they call a CYA operation going on. It's cover your butt, basically. From what I can gather, the governor of both Pennsylvania and Ohio, as well as Ohio's EPA, agreed with Norfolk Southern that the best solution to this was to blow the remaining tank cars open and light everything on fire to burn it off. But now they seem to be upset with Norfolk Southern that Norfolk Southern did this and are trying to say that they didn't get all the information from the railroad, this, that, and the other. It seems like they're trying to throw Norfolk Southern under the bus to get rid of any culpability on their part. I don't know how much of this is actually the case or not. But like you said, like I said, the coverage is all over the map. I don't think anybody really wants, at the government level, at the company level, wants the media to know who said what and who did what and when. Obviously, it's a bad situation. It's hard to tell if they made the best of a bad situation or if politicians and business combined to make a bad decision out of something that could have been less bad. Really hard to say. I'll wrap it up there. But again, criminally liable, I haven't seen that they violated any laws, so I'd say no on that part.
I think Norfolk Southern did a really poor job in the first few days following this event. It's obviously one of the worst, hazardous material spills they've ever encountered, but they should be used to this by now. I used to work for Norfolk Southern, and I responded to many derailments, and usually there's protocol in place. It's pretty crazy. When you respond to a derailment, you basically have to agree that you're not going to say a single word to anybody. You just say no comment. Otherwise, you'll probably get fired. And they fly in these big heavy hitters and their smooth talkers, and their whole job is just to do PR damage control, and they basically get a handle on the situation. Now, with the oil spill in East Palestine, I agree with Alex. It was kind of a cover your butt situation, and they should have come right out and said, hey, this is a huge deal. We messed up. we're going to get this cleaned up, and we spilled a whole bunch of toxic chemicals in the ground. It's going to have all these cascading effects, and we want to make this right. But instead, they basically, try to cover their butts. And I guess they released the whole chemical manifest on Super Bowl Sunday. And a lot of people were upset about that because they were making it seem like, hey, when everyone's looking this way, we're gonna come out here and disclose actually what happened. Should they be held criminally liable? I agree with Alex. Did they commit a crime? Probably not. But going forward, this will certainly change the way hazardous materials are transported. I don't know why there's not measures in place for these things already. I've seen designs of tankers where they have like the materials are in a plastic bag, so if it does derail, it's not going to spill and have huge environmental impacts. Because this stuff is nasty. It's going to get in the Ohio River Basin. It might take years to actually discover the full effects. So it's a big deal, and I think Norfolk Southern needs to come right out and start addressing it as such.
I think we have a system that makes it very, very difficult for large corporations to do the right thing. Norfolk Southern is a highly regulated company and a highly regulated industry. And years ago, I remember reading an article in the Wall Street Journal about malpractice suits, where doctors make mistakes in the operating room, and their attorneys will tell them, "Don't ever say you made a mistake." But in small towns, sometimes you have a doctor who's in Safeway behind one of the patients that he hurt in the operating room, and there's that social altercation that the person says, "I wouldn't have sued if the doctor had just said I'm sorry." But the attorneys basically say, if you say you're sorry, it's going to cost you $1 bazillion more than if you just keep your mouth shut and let us work on your behalf. So I think Norfolk Southern has a protocol. They went around spreading cash. I think they paid $1,000 to every family that needed to be evacuated. But they also had the disclaimer saying, we are not taking responsibility for this. We're just doing this because it's the right thing to do. It's a very, very complex legal environment where everybody's pointing fingers, because Norfolk Southern is going to go, well, what did we do wrong compared to what did the feds do wrong? And then the feds are going, I wonder if it was union or management who made the mistake here. So it's really hard to jump in with both feet until you really know who to blame. And then once you know you're blamed, you got to ask, well, if it's me, I want to downplay it. But if it's the other guy, I want to blow it out way out of proportion to get some political mileage out of this. So if anything, I don't believe that Norfolk Southern is criminally liable. They may be civilly liable, but they have a system where it's really hard to win.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think people understand that derailments happen, accidents happen. Obviously, nobody wants to see chlorine gas floating around your town, because that's almost as bad as having a nuclear disaster or something like that. But I think people get it that you have to transport dangerous chemicals. Trains do it all the time, and that sometimes accidents happen. And I think people just want to see that you're doing stuff about it, and that we weren't ignoring stuff, and that people actually care. And I don't know what it's like in East Palestine. From what I've heard is that everybody showed up when it happened, and the EPA says they're doing what they need to be doing. Norfolk Southern says they're doing what they need to be doing. But there was a pretty delayed reaction from the media about it, because I saw it blown up on Twitter days before I actually saw anything in the Wall Street Journal. I actually remember searching the Wall Street Journal for this incident and couldn't find it. And I thought maybe it was in, I don't know. I didn't know where it was, but it's one of those things where I had to question the validity, how valid this was, because it was just on Twitter and not on any of the major news sources. And I assumed that something this big would be carried by like the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and all that stuff. And I saw nothing about it. And I think some people are just a little irked that it took so long for people to say something about it. It took Pete Buttigieg a while to acknowledge it. He had a couple opportunities and just kind of skipped over it. There's nobody really acknowledged what was going on until days later. Like you said, they started releasing stuff during the Super Bowl. I think that rubs people the wrong way. And obviously, you don't want nasty chemicals floating around your town. And I certainly, for one, even though the EPA is telling everybody, yeah, it's fine, you can go back to your home and drink the water. I'd probably be drinking bottled water for a for at least a couple more months just to make sure everything's actually all clear.
No, it's okay. They had congressmen drinking glasses of water from East Palestine from the tap, so you know
Right.
it's good.
Yeah. Exactly. But I've heard like nasty stuff. Like there's animals dying, like people's pets are dying. There's like weird smells in the air. Yeah, if I was a citizen of East Palestine, I would be concerned. That's for sure. All right. So stagflation is a mix of stagnating growth and rising prices, and has been generally viewed as a relic of the 1970s. But economists are warning it could make a comeback. Do you think that stagnation is going to make a comeback either this year or next year? And what impact do you think it would have on the markets?
Well, to start with, if we just look at it as stagnant GDP growth and rising prices, we already had a brief bout of it last year. Very, very brief, very, very mild. But if economists increasingly predicting a recession either this year or next are right, while at the same time increasingly the Federal Reserve is predicting sticky inflation, quote unquote, where inflation is higher for longer than they were hoping, then we will get something resembling stagflation, not necessarily exactly the same form that the 1970s saw it. There might be different reasons or different effects from it, but I do think something along those lines is coming unless they really, really can get inflation under control, which we don't know if they can. I think there are a number of reasons why it's happening now, and why I think it's going to potentially be around for a decent amount of time. A lot of it has to do with like the baby boomers retiring, and what they're doing is they're leaving the job market. There aren't enough Gen Xers to replace them at the top of the ladder, and there just aren't enough millennials who are also capable of filling all those jobs. So you have a skilled, educated labor shortage that, typically when the United States get immigrants, the bulk of them are unskilled, uneducated from Central America, and that's not going to solve the problem. So we're probably going to see rising wages for a while. And even in some places in the lower end of the economic ladder, we'll see that. In addition, when baby boomers retire, when anybody retires, really, a lot of those people, they take their money out of stocks and put it into bonds, or they get more conservative. And so you're probably not going to see as much money flowing into growth companies as you do like utility companies, for example, that pay a dividend. So, that'll have an impact, but there's a lot of things that would have an impact on this. Now, what do I think the market impacts would be? Well, in a broader sense, the last time around that this happened in the 70s, early 80s, the things that did well were things like precious metals, utilities, grocery stores, energy companies, things that people can't really live without. Like you can't just stop eating, right? You can't just stop driving to work. I guess you could if you lose your job, but you're probably not going to stop, buying peanut butter and jelly. So, in a broader sense, last time value came into favor over growth. As companies so like today, if you look at these big tech companies or even small tech companies that pile up debt, they make absolutely no money. It's probably going to be harder for those companies to stay in business and for investors to make money hand over fists with those. Especially if borrowing costs are 3, 4, 5, 6 times higher for debt than they were 18 months ago. Because we don't have a crystal ball. Who knows what's going to happen? Maybe a wider war in Europe or a war in Asia, if those things happen, can change the equation. If the Federal Reserve just all of a sudden just drops interest rates back to zero and decides they're not even going to try and fight inflation, who knows? But yeah, overall, hopefully it won't be too bad for the American people, but I do ultimately think stagflation is probably coming and may be around for longer than people hope.
So reading about economist predictions and analyst predictions on the future of the economy, it kind of reminds me of that scene in A Princess Bride. Remember the Battle of Wit scene? And there's those two guys, and they're drinking wine, and one of them's poisoned. And the guy in the black mask knows which one is poisoned, and the Sicilian doesn't, so he gets to choose which glass of wine he drinks. And the Sicilian is like, well, I know you didn't give the poison one to me, but unless I knew you didn't give the poison one to me, well, unless you knew I knew you wouldn't give it's kind of like that with these economists and these analysts. There's so many variables, and many of them are unknown. So that an accurate prediction of where the economy is going is going to be tough. Stagflation is obviously the new worry du jour in our economy. For the most part, everyone now agrees that inflation is not transitory. People are not expecting the Fed to pull off a soft landing, and now it's, are we going to get hit by stagflation, and if so, how hard and how long might it last? I think that you could probably make the argument that our economy is already experiencing a small degree of stagflation. GDP is weak and inflation is high. That's basically the environment for stagflation. Your economy is not growing and inflation is still growing. However, if stagflation were going to develop and persist, I think it's going to be different than what a lot of people's expectations are, and that was the stagflation in the 1970s. The fact is, the U.S. economy's changed a lot since the 1970s. First of all, although energy costs are still pretty important, they probably matter less now than they used to. In fact, every U.S. dollar every U.S. dollar of economic output takes about 70% less petroleum to produce than it did in the 70s. Also, policymakers today are more attuned to inflation than they were a few decades ago. Most central banks today have very specific targets, which makes it less likely that they'll miss runaway inflation. Also, we have a Fed that's acting as the Paul Volcker. They're raising interest rates, and it doesn't seem like they're going to stop doing that. And meanwhile, even though growth does appear to be semi-weak, the economy is still showing a decent degree of resilience. People are still spending money despite the higher prices, and businesses continue to hire. Maybe not large tech, but businesses at large are still hiring. Now, if the economy does actually stagflate and it's bad, obviously that will result in prices being squeezed. Household budgets will be squeezed. We'll see a reduction in consumer spending, slower business growth, a decrease in stock and bond prices. Now, all that said, it wouldn't be fun, but this is why it's always important to plan ahead and expect bad patches in the economy. To go back to the Princess Bride analogy, I would rather be the guy in the mask who he's prepared. He has a tolerance to the poison. It doesn't matter which glass he chooses. He's prepared, so it's not going to affect him.
In 1992, I was in the Philippines when Mount Pinatubo erupted, and it destroyed the Zambales province. I mean, just devastated it. The volcanic ash was on all the major roads and highways. And then when the monsoon rains came, it just basically turned it into wet cement, making travel just about impossible. There was no electricity. There was no clean water. I mean, it just devastated. And many of the places where we were operating, wouldn't necessarily say it was metropolitan, but it certainly was urban. And for about 3 weeks to a month, people walked around in a daze, and they just like shell shocked. It's like, oh my gosh. And you read the Stars and Stripes newspaper, the Pacific edition, and it was talking about how the damage caused by this volcano is going to be felt for 1,000 years, and I mean all this gloom and doom stuff. Well, the Filipinos, who actually were folks who lived in the country, they were nationals. They didn't have the luxury of just sitting around in a state of morose. They had to like eat and stuff. So at about the 4 week mark, they started coming out of their houses and just started picking up trash, and they started clearing off their area. And then pretty soon the roads between the different businesses started to open up, and they started trading again. And then they started bringing in ice and beer back to the bars. And then somebody had a generator, and they brought in a band. And then pretty soon it kind of got back to normal at about the 3 or the 4 month mark. We're kind of in a state of morose right now, kind of recovering from this whole pandemic, and people are still walking around in a daze. And they still have just enough money in their pockets that they don't have to be devastated. Once that last dime is spent or the last bit of credit is left on the credit card, then people will actually get outside their houses and start doing things. To Drew's point, being prepared, there's always going to be some sort of calamity economically in the future. If the economy doesn't grow, the stock market will suffer. If the economy grows, the stock market's going to do great. It really is that simple. What will make the economy grow is people quit walking around in a daze and get out there and just continue to produce like there's hope in tomorrow. I always bet on hope. I always bet on the future, because people who haven't bet on the future in the past in America always lose. So in my case, I'm acting like tomorrow is going to be a brighter day. I invest like it's going to be a brighter day, because historically, at some point, there's going to be a charismatic leader who's going to inspire enough people to get out there and start producing again, and the economy will pick up. So be prepared for the worst, but err on the side of hope and faith in the future.
So I think that the two things that cause stagflation are, one, economic shock, and two, bad policy. And you had both of those in 2020. So pandemic, economic shock, and then you had basically the Federal Reserve pumping so much money into the economy after that to try and help people. And basically what you get is a situation where you have essentially a patient that gets like an out of control heart rate. So I've known a couple of people that have had to go to the hospital because their heart rate accelerates to the point where it's bad. And so what they typically do is they take the paddles, right, hit you with the paddles, stop your heart, and allow it to reset itself. And that's kind of what in the 1970s, that's essentially what Paul Volcker did, is they just did one huge rate hike that kind of just reset, just cool everybody's jets, reset the economy, and then you entered the period of the great, what they think they dubbed the Great Moderation, and the thing that's different about this time is that we have the 1970s to look back on, so we have some experience with stagflation, and I think Jerome Powell has been acutely aware that we don't. While inflation is bad, I think the overall consensus is that stagflation is worse. And I think the Federal Reserve has been keeping a very close eye on where we're at, and they're very wary about entering like a stagflation type of environment. And so instead of doing a Paul Volcker kind of thing where they basically hit the economy with the paddles, they've been slowly doing that over the last year. They've been doing these bigger than typical rate hikes. And instead of having to prevent us from having to do one large one, we've done them small, kind of like preventative hikes, just to make sure that the patient's heart rate doesn't get too high after we've hit it with, unlimited, I guess not unlimited, but a ton of caffeine, if you will. And so now the economy's heart rate is going nuts. And now we're worried that it's going to get out of control. And the only way to do that is to hit it with the proverbial paddles. And that's kind of what they're doing, but they're doing it in smaller doses than they did in the 1970s. And who knows what's going to happen, because job layoffs in the tech industry, if you look at the tech industry versus where the economy is, you have stagflation, but you also have hiring in other industries that would maybe think that we're not entering a recession. So I don't think it's going to be just like the 1970s. It may not be as worse as it was, just because I feel like there's been more preventative efforts by the Federal Reserve to do that. And I'm not saying that the Federal Reserve is going to save us, because I think a lot of it was caused, a lot of the problems were caused by them in the first place, but I don't think it's going to be the same type of stagflation that we saw in the 1970s. All right, so move on. The next question here is that California voters in 2016 approved a ballot measure that allowed the cultivation, sale, and possession of pot for recreational use. Since then, high taxes, regulation have made it harder for state licensed businesses to make money. Significantly higher prices in the state regulated market have led to a boom in the black market controlled by drug cartels. Why do you think the legalization of marijuana did not work for California? And we're running out of time here, so
yeah, I'm going to keep this a little bit brief. You can't really get a regulated and taxed industry if you have a pathological refusal to enforce, immigration and, organized crime laws. And that's exactly what the state of California does. They have zero interest in cooperating with the federal government when it comes to preventing illegal immigration. They don't want anybody who's an illegal alien that hasn't really like, stabs somebody in the face 35 times, pretty much gets released back onto the streets almost immediately. So it makes it very, very easy for the drug cartels to operate both in Mexico and transport their product over the border. And it makes it easy for them to grow illegal marijuana in California itself. So, unfortunately, you get the worst of both worlds. You have a marijuana market that is failing in a state where it should be thriving, while at the same time, the state continues to absolutely do nothing about the criminal enterprises that have operated in and around them for decades. California is not going to solve their unprofitable pot industry until they're willing to deal with immigration and law enforcement issues that they themselves have created.
More and more, I'm becoming a fan of California just because they're almost like this like beaker where all the bad experiments take place. They figure out the worst ways to do things, so the rest of the country can say, "Hey, let's not do it that way." California, it kind of boils down just to taxes and regulations. They're creating an environment for pot growers not to be able to compete, and illegals are always going to have the advantage as long as they're in that kind of environment. Basically, they should stop regulating the heck out of it, maybe not tax it so much, or just decriminalize it. But what they're doing, trying to control the situation, is only making it worse.
I'm going to take Drew to the woodshed for giving California extra credit when he completely ignored that New York is doing exactly the same foolishness.
That's true. Well,
New York is interesting because the reason they changed to make recreational marijuana recreational was because they found that people of color were disproportionately getting arrested for it. So what do? They legalized and then regulated marijuana in New York. And what happens? Now they're disproportionately going after and criminalizing people of color who are selling state-sanctioned, who are not selling it under the regulation. So their whole purpose was to stop arresting people of color, and now they're arresting people of color. Folks, the reality is you get more of what you subsidize and you get less of what you penalize. If you want people to buy regulated, highly taxed marijuana, they're not going to, because they're going to buy it cheaper someplace else. Nobody can tell the difference between cheap marijuana and tax marijuana when you look at it in a bag. So people are going to buy the stuff that's cheap just because that's what people do.
Yeah, I think, you used to be able to just grow it and then sell it, but now you have to like make sure, you got all your paperwork in order, and you don't get out of, obviously people would, it's hard to compete with that when the other guy's just growing it and selling it. So yeah, regulation makes it expensive and more burdensome. So so move on to the next one is that. So basically, these people bought a house that was on a golf course back in 2017, and then what they realized is that their house is getting constantly pelted with golf balls, so much so that they decided to sue the country club that they of the course that they lived next to. I mean, do you think that these people should be suing? I mean, wouldn't you know if you buy a house? Clearly, you've never played golf, because if you bought a house by a golf course, I think there's some assumption that it would be hit by a golf ball. So, I mean, do you think it's fair for them to sue the country club?
Well, in their specific case, it sounds like they are getting more than average because they're on a bend in the golf course. But at the same time, you bought a house on a golf course. I wouldn't want my house to be getting pelted by golf balls all the time. But the solution to that would be I wouldn't have decided to live on a golf course. Anybody can sue for anything, but I don't really have much sympathy for this complaint here.
I don't either. Yeah, if you're allergic to peanut butter, don't eat a peanut butter sandwich. They lived on a golf course. They're going to get hit by golf balls. I don't know if I would I don't know if my knee-jerk reaction would be to sue them. If the country club weren't taking any measures to solve the problem, maybe I would just start tanning in a Speedo in my backyard, or hanging up really obnoxious signs, or painting my house a ridiculous color to the point where the country club's like, okay, all right, you win. Or maybe if all is failed, I just move. But back to the matter is, you live on a golf course, it's probably going to happen.
Who lets their kids grow up on a golf course? My gosh, talk about setting your kids up for unrealistic expectations when they get older. If you're living in a luxury, a resort house on the golf course with little kids who can't go out and play in the backyard because they might get with the golf ball, move. We actually have a client who lives on a golf course, and the way she solved this problem is she put a net up.
Yeah, the net works. Clearly, you've never played golf, because every time I'm out, we're at Village Greens, and there's that hole where it's entirely surrounded by houses, and I am scared. I have to use like a smaller club, because if I use a driver, somebody's house is taking it in the window. So so these people must not play golf, or maybe they're just really good at it. All right, so you have 1 minute, Alex. Vince McMahon is asking $9 billion for the WWE. Do you think that's fairly valued?
Well, market cap is 6.5 billion, so it's a little bit high, but streaming services and TV networks alike are bidding more and more for sports and quasi-sports. I don't know if he'll get 9 billion, but somebody will at least pay. If somebody wants it, they'll pay a lot of money for it.
I think fair market value is kind of a liquid concept right now. I think he'll probably get it if he wants to advertise it for that.
I think there's a market for it.
I wouldn't know. I never watch it, and I just don't get it. So, All right, that's it for episode 72 of Farm to Markets. We'll see you next week.